Now that we have prepared and set up our development environment, we need to actually install the software we will use to develop apps for Android M. In this session, we will be discussing one of those tools, the Android Software Development Kit, also known as the Android SDK. The Android SDK is the software development kit for Android application development. It contains all of the tools needed for developing Android apps, which includes the Integrated Development Environment, IDE, Android Studio, Google APIs, tools, emulators, etc. You can get the Android SDK from the Android Developer Portal, and there you will see two SDK bundles. The Android SDK bundle for Android Studio, which contains the Android Studio IDE, SDK tools, etc., or the standalone SDK tools, which provides the basic SDK tools for apps development without an IDE. For the purposes of this course, you will be downloading and installing the first one, the Android SDK bundle with the Android Studio IDE. To download the Android SDK, go to the Android developer site at https:/developer.android.com/sdk/index.html#other and click on Download Android Studio. It is available as a zip file that contains the SDK Manager, the AVD Manager, platforms, platform tools, system images, tools add-ons, build tools, docs, samples, etc. We're going to discuss the SDK and AVD managers in more detail now. So what is the Android SDK Manager? The SDK Manager is a tool that allows you to manage the selection and downloading of the different tools, platforms, and component packages in the Android SDK. When the SDK tools are updated or a new version of the Android platform is released, you can use the SDK Manager to quickly download them to your environment. You can launch the SDK Manager in any of the following ways. From Android Studio, select Tools, Android, SDK Manager. On Windows, double-click the sdkmanager.exe file at the root of the Android SDK directory. On Mac or Linux, open a terminal and navigate to the Tools directory in the location where the Android SDK is installed, and then execute Android SDK. When you open the Android SDK Manager application, you will see a listing of tools, documentation, SDK platform, samples for SDK, system images, and sources for Android SDK. All of these options are available for each platform. You first need to select the required packages and then click Install X Packages, where X is the number you have selected. This will install everything for you or update it if you have already installed the SDK. As you begin working with Android development, you will see that there is a relationship between an Android version and an API level. You can see this relationship on this slide. You can see that for each different Android version, there is a corresponding API level. As you install the Android SDK yourself, you will want to know which packages have to be installed and which ones are recommended. The required packages are SDK Tools, SDK Platform Tools, and SDK Platform. Installing the above three packages is mandatory whether you're developing on Windows, Mac, or Linux. The recommended packages are System Image, Android Support Library, SDK Samples, Android Support Repository, Google Play Services, and Google Repository. System Image is recommended when you are going to run the application in the emulator. Android Support Libraries are needed for backward compatibility with older Android OS versions. SDK Samples will provide you with sample projects. Android Support Repository includes a local Maven repository for support libraries. Google Play Services includes the Google Play Services client library and sample code. Google Repository includes a local Maven repository for Google libraries. The SDK Update Sites tab displays the sites that Android Studio checks for Android SDK and third-party updates. You can add other sites that host their own Android SDK add-ons and then download the SDK add-ons from those sites. For example, a mobile carrier or device manufacturer might offer additional API libraries that are supported by their own Android-powered devices. In order to develop using their libraries, you must install their Android SDK add-on if it is not already available as a third-party add-on. If a carrier or device manufacturer has hosted an SDK add-on repository file on their website, Follow these steps to add their site to the Android SDK Manager. Select Tools, Manage Add-on Sites, User-Defined Sites, New. Enter the URL and click OK. If you encounter a problem connecting to a site in SDK Manager, then check whether you are accessing it via the HTTP protocol. For this option, select Tools, Options, and click the checkbox labeled Force HTTPS, Sources to be fetched using HTTP. Now that we have covered the SDK Manager, let's talk about the next key item, AVD Manager. What exactly is AVD Manager? AVD Manager is the Android Virtual Device Manager. It provides a graphical user interface in which you can create and manage Android virtual devices, or AVDs, which are required by the Android emulator. The Android emulator is a mobile device emulator that is a virtual mobile device that runs on your computer. The emulator lets you develop and test Android applications without using a physical device. So we need the AVD Manager because it allows you to manage these virtual devices on your computer. To install it from Android Studio, select Tools, Android, AVD Manager, or click the AVD Manager icon in the toolbar. In Windows, double-click the avdmanager.exe file at the root of Android SDK directory. While executing the AVD application from the downloaded SDK files, you will get a button on the right which gives you the option to create an Android virtual device using the AVD Manager. You can create a new Android virtual device using this Create option. The tab called Device Definitions lists normal device definitions that are available like Android TV, screen size, resolution, platform, etc. So that concludes our discussion on installing and configuring the Android SDK. We'll see you back here for our next session.